morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for coming to the fourth week in Lent, the Bishop's Lenten series, Letting Go. And the theme today is letting go of condemnation.
Oh, that's a good one.
Ready for me?
Yes.
That's not going to be
I'll let you reflect on that for a couple of moments. The scripture reading that they have here on the discussion page, John 3:14-21, they've lifted up Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus about what he came to do. And then from Numbers, God made a way of life and healing for the people. And then from Ephesians, God again made a way of life and healing for the people. I wonder if that's meant to be replicated like that, perhaps. So the reflection from Bishop Wright: as recipients of this gracious purpose and act of God, we have to let go of the right to condemn others. Foregoing condemnation of others, or even ourselves, is deeper than performing politeness towards each other, or better, kinder self-talk. Letting go of condemnation is about the appreciation of how God uses power. Mercy is a sublime expression of power. Letting go of condemnation is a God-prompted transformation of orientation. That last sentence is quite thought-provoking. Letting go of condemnation is a God-prompted transformation of orientation. So any comments about the video itself before we jump into the discussion questions?
I think, well, this is related to the video. I didn't know that. Was Bishop Wright in the Navy?
He was.
I didn't know that.
I didn't know that his wife is narrating, so I don't know if she was speaking if she was in the Navy as well. So I don't know. He was, I know that.
But before priesthood, obviously.
Yes.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Now, when I heard that, I thought, well, maybe she was too.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Is there anything that man can't do?
Well, you said the operative word there is man. So yes, no one is perfect.
Well said on your part, well said. Well, it was beautiful the way these have been all along. Gorgeously produced, thoughtful and gentle, and he writes, or she writes, whoever is writing the text does an excellent job. Really fine. Aside from the graph that you just mentioned, mercy is the sublime expression of power. I don't think I'd ever heard that. I don't know if he got that from somebody or created it, but it is a fine sentence.
Yes, ma'am.
I think what stood out to me is just hearing John 3:17. I was just pulling up the passage on my phone because coming from an evangelical tradition, we memorize 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave his only son to do it, for lose him, should not perish but have eternal life, like when we were 2 years old, right? But we never went on to the next part. I mean, I'm sure we read the whole passage, but like in terms of just ingrained.
Would you read that?
And so the next part, for God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. I mean, that seems to be what he's really honing on in the video and in the reflection. And it's hard for me to think about that call to not condemn the world, because God didn't send Jesus to condemn the world in relation to that, in relation to the broader message of salvation.
Right. And I think that the video does a good job of reiterating God loved the world. Somewhere along the way, we get caught up in worldliness and the world not being good. But God created the world. God loves the world. And then I really appreciated that image of pulling the person out of the water. Just what one feels like in that situation. I've not been in that situation. But imagining a person, and then it becomes a metaphor, situation when you're surrounded by something, not knowing if you're going to make it or not, drowning in something. And then along comes, we'll say, a messenger from God to reach down and then pull one up out of stormy waters and precarious situations. God saving.
I have always contrasted the Old and New Testaments, judgment, mercy, just as a shorthand. And condemnation, love, again, shorthand. The Old Testament is pretty tough on us as members of the family of God. Post Jesus, it's much kinder to us. And I've often worried that the decline in established Christian churches is because we gave up on hell. If we could just condemn people again, we'd get butts in pews.
Well, some of those denominations that do preach hell are drawing people in.
I know.
They are. They're getting them in pews.
I know. And look at our democracy, what's going on. I know.
But I'm the beneficiary of a beneficent and forgiving God. My poor mother, when I came out to her, was worried about whether I would be saved and whether I would go to heaven. And I turned to her and I said, Mom, I bet you pray for forgiveness every day, just like I do. And then she started crying and it was all over.
Okay, let's move to the discussion questions. The first one, share about a time when you experienced mercy when you expected condemnation. How did that affect you? Let's not go through, I'm just going to read them, and so if there's one that speaks to you that you'd like to respond to, you're welcome to do that. So I'm just going to read through the questions. Share about a time when you gave mercy rather than condemnation. What was that experience like? How has your experience of mercy transformed your orientation toward others and yourself? Or how do you want it to? How do you try to live this out in everyday life and show this to the world? And then the last one, who might need an experience of God's mercy and freedom from condemnation today? How might you offer that?
Well, I can talk in a general sense. I don't know that it fits any of these exactly, but the whole condemnation thing, one thing I did not know about myself until probably the last 10 years maybe, it's been pretty recent, maybe 5 years, is that I can come across much more harshly than what I'm intending to. It's like I'm meaning to just be imparting something that is benign, but it can come across as, oh. And I don't remember even how I began to get a clue that I was doing that, but I'm so grateful that I did, because I don't want to do that at all. That's just not who I intend to be and want to be. And so I've thought a lot about that whole thing, and I think what happens is, I think I know that I am very much programmed to condemn myself, to watch every step I'm taking, and this one's wrong, and no, that one's wrong, and no, I should go here, and no, you shouldn't do that. I've been programmed that way since birth, and I have decided in my head that that's where I need to start. That if I ease up on me first, then I'm going to automatically be kinder in how I present my thoughts to others. And that seems to be working. I mean, I don't have an example to share exactly, but overall, it seems like I'm easing up on myself, and I don't get the shocked looks from others that sometimes then have shocked me, like what I say. So, that's my thought about this.
Thank you.
Well, certainly fellow drivers need freedom from my condemnation and contempt. I once had an Episcopal priest say that her sacrifice in Lent was to stop using the F word in traffic. And I have not gone that far in my Lenten discipline. But there's no question in my mind that's where I need to benefit from God's mercy and where I need to share God's mercy.
Thank you.
I feel like I'm giving my Emory students a lot of mercy in terms of like flexibility with deadlines and letting them do makeup work when they need to miss class. But I get very mixed responses, right? So I have one student who says, "Thank you so much. Someone died in my family. None of my other professors were like, willing to be this way, right?" And then I have another student who's like, "The makeup assignments are too long, blah, blah, blah." And so it's a mixed bag. I feel like a small but important way I've had mercy, not condemnation, extended to me is the DeKalb County Public Library no longer charging late fees. Like fines for late returns of books.
It's the little things, isn't it?
So it truly is a free public library.
Yes.
No fine.
Well, in that extension of mercy, a lot of
Yes.
library systems have gone that way. It's very meaningful to other people who are more financially strapped.
And like Lynn, you just said that it's a really big deal to you, and it's really a small thing that they've done. Little things that I'm sorry, I don't think something that is important to you may not be life-changing forever, but that little moment of mercy, that little moment of, lifting the whatever was on your heart, the anger or whatever, little bits at a time, over and over again. This is important. And it's one great big,
Yeah, the constant reinforcement of the concept. Yeah.
What else seems to be a tough theme of condemnation seems to be a little bit tough. It's not something that we go around thinking about. I think on the top of our heads, we may look at situations or persons' actions, and so we may internally or verbally condemn them. But I think in general, we're probably not thinking about that, we're not talking about that. I think about situations that arise, like internationally, if there is a heinous act or crime, and we're wanting someone in our political leadership to condemn what has happened. But outside of that, I don't think that we are, as part of our vernacular much, at least actively. So this brings even more of a Lenten challenge. Lent should be a challenge. We should be challenged to think about things that we don't normally do.
And I think, like you said, it's not commonly in our vernacular to condemn, but what is the act? What in your heart are you doing? It's not using the word condemnation, but thinking something else towards somebody, anger or resentment or something like that. And it's almost like, in effect, the same kind of thing. You still have this negativity.
Well, is it the same?
No. And what I'm saying is that I never use the word condemnation. In traffic, you're not condemning somebody.
I certainly am.
but the act of forgiveness, the act of mercy is, the opposite. Whether you're talking about condemnation or using a different term. I don't think of myself a person who ever uses the word condemnation or the act of condemnation, but I don't know.
To me, condemnation feels like you're pushing someone outside of something, whereas saving is like you're bringing them in. thinking about your comment about like Old Testament versus New Testament, there is some condemnation if you keep reading. In verse, like the right after the, you know, God so loved the world, God did not send His Son to condemn the world, but the world might be saved through Him. Then it goes to whoever believes in Him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already, because he hasn't believed. The light of the world came. Everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light. So it's not like God is like casting them, throwing them away from the rescue boat, you know, to go with that metaphor, but it's like they're not going to the light of the rescue boat themselves because they're so like wrapped up in their own darkness, which is interesting to think about. So it's not necessarily like condemnation doesn't exist in this Nicodemus conversation. It's like the people themselves are doing it to themselves, right? Like God isn't the one doing it to them. God's there to save them. They're just not accepting that or coming to that. And so thinking about it in those terms of like, who do we push away versus who do we pull in, or how do we push ourselves away from God as opposed to being pulled in?
Thinking about Chris's idea of we don't talk about condemnation, and I can see that, but I'm also very self-aware of how what I internally might perceive as little judgments, and how that can affect a person as if they are being condemned. And experience I had in my own life when I was a college student, doing a very stupid thing to a very good group of people and having it totally go wrong and fearing, oh God, what are they going to think of me? And then somebody walks up to me in a hallway and says, hey, welcome, we still want to get to know you. And that was life-changing.
That is nice. Yeah.
And you know, it wasn't, nobody was condemning me. I felt a kind of fear of condemnation or judgment, but the positive action of expressing welcome again was transformative.
That's a good point you brought up, the situation where we may perceive we're being condemned, but in reality, that may not be the case. And then you extended that act of hospitality, which dispelled your whole idea of what was happening to the situation, in the situation.
Yeah. I do that all the time. I'm always assuming that people are thinking, I'm sorry, were you? Did you have your hand up?
Eventually.
Yes,
I don't mind, go ahead.
Paul.
I think you were the one who made the comment about some of the churches that are gathering more people from a position of there. And last week, the Old Testament reading was Exodus and involved something I don't think I'd ever read. God saying, if you don't do a good job, I'm going to condemn your children, your grandchildren, and one more generation.
Yeah.
And I'm going, that's not the God that I grew up with. The God in the church up in New England.
Yeah.
And if God's so far above what I can understand, but if God is loving and embracing and accepting, but in the time when the Old Testament Gospels were written, books were written, if that was how people interpreted events, and now if we're getting a percentage of people that are turning more towards a God will condemn you kind of thing, I'm going, maybe God didn't change. Maybe it's not that when Jesus came, God changed. Maybe it's that our understanding of how to perceive of God has gone through a sine wave shift. And with what's going on the planet these days, I can easily see us moving into that kind of a fearful, condemning place. That those sine waves don't change quickly.
No.
And that's very sad for me and scary.
Well, in the reading from Numbers, which we'll hear shortly, I don't want to spoil it, But the people are against God and Moses, and then God sends these serpents to bite the people. And then God says, well, make, a staff, the serpent, the people look at it and they are healed. But see, that's a big contrast. The God of the Old Testament contrasts against the God of the New Testament. And so we think about what Jesus came to do. We think about the Old Testament being written as a way to explain what was happening to the people. And, we can look around today and we can ask, well, where is the God of the Old Testament? Because we see all of these ills happening in society. Why isn't that God zapping people?
Sicking the snakes on them.
Exactly.
Right. So, but as we know, Jesus said, the commandments. God is love God, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So it is about love. That does not mean that people don't do bad things. It doesn't mean that because God is not intervening as we would desire it. But we know that God and believe that God has the power to do that. And if we're paying attention, we can see God's power active in the world.
And for me, one of the powers of the New Testament, really the audacity of the evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Paul. They were all Jewish, came out of very learned backgrounds, very pious backgrounds, living through turbulent times, the destruction of the temple, and so on. And they had the audacity to write a new set of stories that took the old set of stories and said, you don't understand what it meant.
Yeah, right.
You've been getting it wrong for centuries, for millennia. How can you possibly have the courage or the audacity to say that? But they did. It's just in that simile, we have a serpent, we have a pole. Moses puts the serpent on a pole. Everyone looks at it. You're cured. You're saved. And what does Jesus say in John 3? Just as Moses lifted up the serpent, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. The pole is the cross, the serpent is Christ. Whoever thought of that? And they did it systematically. It was well known as a typological reading. They went through the whole Hebrew scriptures and they said, you don't know what that really means. And that's incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
It's also, it's why it's a stumbling block for the Jews and foolishness to the Greeks.
Was it also a way in which to tie people to the Hebrew text?
Yeah, not one letter
So
of the law
that
shall
this was
be.
clear that this was not a new religion that was being born, but it was something deeply rooted
Exactly.
in Judaism.
Yeah, not one letter of the law shall be unfulfilled.
Well, I'm thinking of that sine wave image, and to me it's so vivid. God's infinite. We can only understand the tiniest piece of Him. And so anytime we get concrete about who God is or how we relate to God, it's such a brief moment in time and such a tiny piece of the infinite that we're bound to be inadequate and get it wrong. And the decisions or the mood within a society about how to relate to God are just that. It's society's mood and tone that they project onto the infinite. And that, to me, is what makes the curve, the way it's going currently, pretty frightening. Because the society is in a sort of a paranoid state, and they're retrenching to fascism in various places. And suddenly, a fascist God is appealing to people? Yikes.
I'm thinking about human nature because when all is said and done, people wrote both the Old and the New Testament. Okay, so we got to put people in the mix somewhere. And when people are afraid, and the more afraid they get, the more they want structure and boundaries and rules so that they know if I don't step there, it's like when you see the sheep and the goats in the electric fence and they know not to touch them. And there is a safety in that, even though there's also violence in the electric fence kind of thing. And I think in some ways it takes a lot of courage and trust to not be so bound up by fear that you need all those rules. So maybe that's what we're seeing now, and maybe the whole COVID thing made it worse because people got more and more afraid of the things. Here are the plagues, and I don't know, but
I keep thinking of Temple Grandin as we talk about sheep and goats. The gimmick that she developed that allowed people to handle cattle better is that she narrowed them into a single path. She limited their vision. She prohibited them from seeing others in line to the abattoir. And so often I think the folks who condemn immigrants or come up with reasons to hate another country are purposely narrowing our vision.
And conversely, I think the cure is for us to see each other and hear each other and talk to each other, learn from each other. That's why I like this format so well. We can do that because I think we need to.
That makes me think about thoroughbred horse racing, where the horses wear blinders.
Yeah,
You
right.
have to wear blinders so you can be narrowly focused in order to what? Win.
Yes.
Ooh.
Yes. And don't you all love those races where someone has fallen and the person out in the lead will go back and help the person? Don't you just? To me that's just so wonderful. It's not that we gotta all win.
John's comment sparked in me a memory many years ago, sort of a lifetime ago. I studied evangelicalism in politics. And part of my reading in association with that, I don't remember the quotation exactly, but I always remember the thought that fundamentalism globally, whether you look at it in Christianity, Judaism, Islam, whatever, is a struggle to find some perceived source or sense of certainty in the face of an increasingly uncertain world.
Yes.
And talking about mercy, I'm thinking about the call that we may have to reach out to those people and acknowledge their anxiety, their stress, and how they're coping with this appeal to certainty. If we could find a compassionate way to say, this is another way to step into the uncertainty. And show them the mercy of that, rather than just recoiling at their appeal to fundamentalism.
Well, in the few minutes we have left, how about we look at the last question under takeaway? Two of them. In what other ways are you, your church, working for justice and mercy for those most easily dismissed or condemned? Or how can you? First, we determine who do we see in those categories? Most easily dismissed or condemned? No thoughts?
Well, I'm thinking that there are so many that on the parish level you sort of have to pick. There are migrant people who are condemned for their origin, their status. There are people in the criminal justice system or recently out of the probably even more pressing are those who are recently, well, not so recently, out of the criminal justice system, who have to rebuild lives with that mark of Cain still on them. And that's just the top of it.
Okay, so we have immigrants and those re-entering society after incarceration.
And of course, the homeless that we see on the street. I don't see a lot of begging because I'm in my car condemning other drivers. So I don't encounter homeless people on the streets. But there's a way, and I rarely give money when somebody is begging, but I always acknowledge them. And I don't know if that's to soothe my liberal consciousness or whether it's a genuine act of mercy. But those folks are so easily ignored and by inference condemned. And I endeavor to see them as children of God.
Think of like Neva leading the ministry to people on death row. That's about like as condemned as you can get, condemned to die in the criminal system. And involving St. Bart's people in that. But what you were saying, Ken, I'm also thinking about like, in our particular Episcopal church, maybe people easily dismissed and condemned are like fundamentalists, or people with different political views that are, but that feels trickier because the power dynamics are not the same. Like who condemned by who is the question, dismissed by who, and then what effect does that have? Like those questions are going to be really different for.
But if you're the perceived, I'm going to use simple labels, and it's not that reductionist, but if you as a liberal are the perceived condemner of the conservative, then it is you, the liberal, who has the call to reach out. As hard as that would be.
Or to at least work on your own condemnation. So that you're not being as condemning.
When Gene Robinson was consecrated as bishop and it created such a schism in the Episcopal Church, one of the leading schismatic congregations was the Falls Church, just outside D.C. And we attended St. Thomas's DuPont Circle, which was a 99% gay population. And so we, there was lots of anger about that, and people were suing Falls Church. Falls Church was suing, and we gathered a group of people and approached the Falls Church about some sort of conciliation, and they wouldn't see us.
Oh, wow.
Yesterday, during the celebration of life for a parishioner, it was quite touching to hear her son give remarks. And almost right away, he mentioned the fact that they disagreed on politics, religion, and I can't remember, but there was 3 areas. But bottom line was, he always knew that she loved him, in spite of those different perspectives. There are a lot of times in families, there's a different perspective, and love is not extended, or it's not obvious. People cannot overcome different opinions and agree to disagree and still love. So I think perhaps that's the greater message here in terms of dealing with condemnation, is to rise above it and agree and strive to walk in the love ethics that Jesus talks about.
I just thought of another thing too. I think another piece of this for each of us is to realize that when someone else is condemning of us, that's their stuff. That doesn't say anything about us. It's saying something about them. And I think that's a helpful one to me, because I tend to, if someone says I'm bad, I think, okay, I'm bad. And I need to.
Sorry, but it's true.
Yeah, exactly. Humor's always one.
Yeah, right. I'm so supportive.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So I think it's important to go, they must be having a bad day or whatever, you know.
Okay, we've come to the end of our time, so let us conclude by saying a prayer together at the bottom of the page. Almighty
And most merciful God, we remember before you all poor and neglected persons whom it would be easy for us to forget. Help us to heal those who are broken in body or spirit, and to turn their sorrow into joy. Amen.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
We'll
you,
continue
Angela.
again next week, week 5.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.